remember right, I think the idea of loving your neighbor is pretty,
Clear.
consistent, in Scripture. And so what better way to love your neighbor than by just inviting them to the front porch?
Yeah.
And just having a gathering, and whether it's beer in the backyard or pancakes on the porch, or just cordoning off the cul-de-sac and just saying, hey, everybody, bring a potluck and we'll have fun.
Yeah.
Research would say, and you know this, that if you know the names of at least 6 of your neighbors, your sense of isolation and some of the anxiety and depression that comes along with those starts to decline dramatically.
I am so excited to be here with Stu Davis, and we've only met briefly a couple times, but I feel your passion when I'm in the same room with you. And so I'm excited to be able to spend this time and really kind of get to know your story. Can we start with just introducing yourself professionally?
Sure. Yeah. So I, for the last 5 years, I co-created, co-founded, and now I'm the director of a nonprofit called We Say 'Cause I Love You, or COS I Love You. Everything in Colorado Springs is COS something. I've been doing that for 5 years. We've been doing stuff in the community for about 8 years. But in 2018, we formalized it as a nonprofit, and I came on as the director shortly after. And I tell people that I sit at the intersection of the church and the city and try to help broker a conversation that wants to happen, but oftentimes breaks down because those two different sectors of our community just use different language.
Yeah.
And so just like any conversation where there's a language barrier, you need to have a translator and then somebody who can just kind of help move the conversation forward. So I work with about 100 local churches in our city, and I also work with a lot of leaders in our public sector, elected and appointed officials, our marketplace sector, and our nonprofit sector to just help build a kind of a collaborative platform to address some of the needs we experience in our community.
Well, and I get excited when about what you're doing because, as a Christian in the mental health space, right? In mental health, as a professional, licensed professional, there's obviously no proselytization, but more above that, there becomes this, you can't talk about spiritual health at all. And we are, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual beings, and we've taken spiritual health out of mental health. And so I love how you say, using that translation, the intent to help and serve has a lot of commonalities.
Yeah.
It's not just about that, and being able to bring our spiritual health back into the conversation. I think it's really important to recognize that our whys might be different. Like you and I may have, if we were from different worldviews or traditions or whatever, faith or otherwise, we might have a different why, but we probably care about some similar things. Right.
And if we can agree that regardless of our why, the what that we commonly care about is just as equally important to both of us, we can do a lot of good things together.
Yeah.
And we can leave all the discussions about the why off to some other day, and not let that hinder us from doing good things about the what. And that's what we spend a lot of time working on.
So share with us your why. What drives, what's that inner drive for you?
Yeah, I guess when I get a chance to tell my story, I talk about kind of my 3 conversions. So my first was spiritual, and realizing that, not only did Christ come to save me, but really came to kind of save the world and restore humanity, and that I get to be invited into that process as well. So that conversion happened when I was a teenager. And my second conversion I would call economic, where I started to really realize God's heart for the poor. And anybody who takes Scripture seriously can't read it without understanding that God is always on the side of the poor. And certainly we can talk about spiritual poverty, and yes, that's true, but the reality is God's heart is very much for the physically destitute, those who are without care and support and are on their own, the widows, the orphans, And so did a lot of work doing community development work through a partnership in Southern Africa, in a small country that at the time was called Swaziland, is now called Eswatini, but was involved there for about 10 years and really got to know and become friends with people who lived a very, very different life from my own, and had a very close personal spiritual relationship with Christ, but also became deep friends of mine. And then my third conversion I just call geographic, where I really started to realize that as much as God cares for the nations, and I should as well, I've been placed in a place. I've been I call Colorado Springs home, and I do think that that's due to sovereign design and with a divine agenda, and that I really started to realize that I can take ownership and responsibility for my own community. And so that third conversion, on top of the other two, is what really led me to start feeling a sense of responsibility and ownership for the place that I call home, and doing my part to bring joy and life, and in a spiritual tradition, in a Christian tradition, we would call it shalom, into this place. So that's a little bit of my why.
Yeah. Well, and you're actually speaking to my heart right now, because I'm a little bit of a rebellious teenager, right? Like I was a rebellious teenager. I don't always just obey and listen, and I have been clearly told that Colorado Springs is where I'm supposed to be. This is, I'm supposed to put my heels down and have roots here for a couple reasons. And I resist it. I resist it because I'm from Florida. I have this, I don't like the wind, whatever, the negative,
Yeah, right.
the negative narrative. But just as you were speaking, God was speaking to my heart, like, this is your next conversion.
There you go. I mean, it's true. Well, so I mean, one of the, the central passage of Scripture behind "Because I Love You," and something that I take very seriously is, and I could talk for a long time about this, so we'll just keep it short, but Jeremiah chapter 29. Everybody who reads that, if I say Jeremiah 29, people think of that passage,
right.
For I know the plans I have for you. What people often, and it's hung up on a bathroom wall somewhere, or a fridge magnet or whatever, what people don't realize is the context of that message is it was a letter written by Jeremiah from the city of Jerusalem, which was sitting in tattered ruins. The temple had been destroyed by the most evil king in the history of the world, Nebuchadnezzar. Terrible, terrible, terrible man leading a terrible army. And he had exiled the entire nation except for the poorest of the poor. And Jeremiah stayed behind with the poorest of the poor to just be a part of his homeland. And he is writing a letter to people who have been exiled to Babylon. So you have a Jewish community that's been exported 1,000 miles away to the most evil city that they can possibly imagine. And the false prophets that had been exiled with them were saying, any day now our Savior, our Messiah, is going to come and rescue us and restore us back to our homeland. And the letter of Jeremiah 29 is Jeremiah, the Lord, speaking through Jeremiah to say, actually, it's going to be 70 years. You're going to be there for 70 years. And what he says is, sit down, settle down, build houses for yourselves, and seek the peace and the prosperity of the city to which I, the Lord, have exiled you. It was his plan to send the exiles into this evil city for the peace and the prosperity of that city. And if you go back and you study, so he's saying, settle in and be the catalyst for the good of this evil city. So I feel like just as God designed it for those exiles to be living there, he's designed you and I, at least for this season, to be in Colorado Springs. We can take that same posture of seeking the peace and the prosperity of this place that the Lord has planted us. And if they could do that, and if actually you go back and study history, that was the season during which several of kind of the 7 ancient wonders of the world, one of them was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, that was all built during the season that those Israelite exiles were living there. What good could we be catalysts for in our city? So that's a big part of my life.
Well, and that verse has been a verse for my children. I mean, Reggie, we went back and forth between Reggie and Jeremiah, and then we decided if Maya was born, she would be Jeremiah. If she was a boy, and Maya, spelled M-I-A-H for Jeremiah. And so that verse has been a part of my children who I've lost and lost here.
Wow.
And so, yeah, wow, you just,
when you read that passage
God just spoke to me through you,
Yeah, when
by
you
the
read
way.
that passage again, that promise of I know the plans I have for you comes on the heels of you're going to be in an uncomfortable situation for 70 years. 2 generations are going to pass away before you get to come home. And that discomfort is my design for not only your good, but for the good of this place that up until now has been a very evil place. And so that promise of prosperity, of God's plan and his faithfulness and his presence is in a pretty difficult setting.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's difficult. What
Right.
I've been going through.
Yes, and
is difficult.
you know that
Yeah.
journey well. God's
Yeah.
promise and His faithfulness comes out of a difficult setting.
Yeah, for sure. Wow, I didn't know I was going to be getting. I
Here you
didn't
go,
know I was going
yeah.
to be receiving here. I thought we were going to be talking about you. No,
No, that's great.
no, but that's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that nugget of wisdom. So, what about you personally in your mental strength journey? How do you take care of yourself mentally?
That's such a good question. Well, first of all, I'm the dad of 3 teenagers. So it's taken quite a turn over the last
Any
handful
girls?
of years. I have 2 girls and a boy. So I have a 19-year-old, an 18-year-old, and a 15-year-old. And so I think a lot of first of all, I had worked hard to establish, I think, some rhythms in my own just personal and spiritual life to try and be on some healthy footing. And I have some spiritual practices that I commit myself to on a daily and a weekly and a monthly basis that are helpful. And I think a lot about spiritual rhythms, and I think that they're really effective. But at the same time, I think a lot of my own just issues and the lies and the falsehoods that I grew up kind of ingesting unconsciously started to really come to the surface as a parent.
Would you share that?
Yeah, certainly. I think about 2 years ago, I began a counseling journey just because I felt like I was not handling the internal challenges of parenting, and specifically parenting teenagers and then making transitions into adulthood, and me, I think, just trying to hang on to what's under my control and what's not. I was like, I'm not handling this well, and I'm agitated, and I don't want to be this way, and something's not right, and things are surfacing that I can't really put a finger on. So I started seeing a counselor, and one of the things that came out of our conversations was this statement that I have unconsciously lived by for probably the majority of my life, which is, if you're not perfect, you're not good. And that was a really striking moment for me to realize. I knew that as a kid I had these perfectionistic tendencies. I wasn't ever OCD, but I had to have really nice handwriting. I had to have a clean room and all these things. I didn't line up my bottles so that all the labels face the same way, but I liked things neat, and I wanted to be, the best on my sports team, and so I worked extra hard and those kinds of perfectionistic things. So as a teen, I was like, this doesn't make any sense. This is not healthy. I need to kind of shed some of this stuff. So I stopped being so perfectionist about my handwriting, and I started just doing some things. Like I left my bed messy, which most people would like, I wish my teenager would clean my room. That was actually like me leaving my bed unmade was like a way to kind of try to shed some of this perfectionism. But I didn't deal with all the internal reasons of why that perfectionism existed in the first place. And so starting to realize that every time my kid does something that feels like it's against me, it's a reflection on me being an imperfect parent. The truth is that's not the case.
Right.
It's a teenager exercising their own authority and trying to figure out where the lines are and all those things.
Yeah.
But I took it as I'm a failure as a parent. And the reality is I've got great kids. I'm very happy with my family life, my marriage, but every time something felt just a little bit off, it was this message of you're a total failure. And man, that was hard to deal with. It was hard to confront. I very much still am working through a lot of that, but that was a major turning point for me, but it had to come through a lot of just difficult conversations with a professional who knew how to ask good questions and uncover some things that just conversations with my wife and my own kids just were not bringing to the surface. So,
and as you were raising your kids when they were younger, did you have those conversations around their mental health?
Not so much when they were younger, but certainly now that I've been on this kind of journey over the last couple of years, we've started to have a lot more conversations, particularly with my 2 daughters, the 19 and 18-year-old, and now to a degree with my son, just about what are they doing to, what are the voices that show up, what are the truths and the lies, what do they pay attention to, what grabs their emotions and their thoughts. And
I think that's so important, and we should stop here and kind of dive into, we all have this negative dialogue that, maybe we're fighting it, and maybe we're, but it's there and it comes back. And how do we confront it, grow from it, and then teach our kids to be able to do that?
Yeah. Yeah, a close friend of mine and I, we've had conversations about, we've each had at different times this counseling journey that we've both been on. And, in our Christian tradition, and we believe that we have an enemy of our soul. And that enemy does not waste any opportunity to expose a little chink in the armor. And we can have something that is so small that happens when we're 5 and 7 and 12 years old.
Right.
That as a man in my mid-40s, I'm thinking, yeah, I left that behind a long time ago. But the enemy had a way of slipping that little pebble in my shoe. And now all of a sudden, that's creating a real limp.
Right.
And that limp starts to show up, years down the road. And so I feel like for me, it's been important for me to start to realize what are those lies that I, despite the fact that I had a great family and a community of friends and people who loved and supported me, as all through my growing up years, the enemy didn't waste one small opportunity to kind of slip in a little lie or expose, something that I feel like was a weakness. And so as I've started to have those conversations with my kids as they're, becoming adults, it is changing the conversation in our household. And I have to reconcile the fact that I'll never be a perfect parent.
Yeah.
And despite my best attempts and my best hopes to be one, I've left some marks on my kids.
Yeah.
And
I've done a whole course on raising mentally strong kids to just show all the mistakes that I made.
Yeah.
Don't do this, and because even when you're trying your hardest to do the right things, teach the right things, have the right environment, there's these scars that occur that impact the way they think about themselves. And
my mom, we were having a conversation a number of years ago, this is probably 8 or 10 years ago, but in which I was kind of talking to her about just struggling as, I felt like for many years, and still, all I've ever wanted to be is just, I want to be a great dad. And I want my kids to feel like, I want to be a professional, I want to be capable, I want to, make my mark in the world in my own little corner of it. But when it comes down to it, if I can leave this earth having been a great dad, that's a good thing. And so the enemy has used that, like, oh, you didn't do it there, you didn't follow through there, And so I think anytime that I feel like that aspiration to be a great dad has fallen short of that mark of perfection, it's just another opportunity for the enemy to come in. So my mom and I were having this conversation, and she said at one point many years ago when I was young, she and my brothers, she realized that every opportunity where she falls short was another opportunity for the Lord to show himself faithful. And I'm like, man, I got to hang on to that. So I've really had to hang on to that. In a lot of ways.
Because we can beat ourselves up as parents, and then we're just creating more of the cycle. And unfortunately, it takes raising kids to reveal these things in us, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And like you said, it's like they're teenagers now.
That's been the hardest mirror. That's the harshest mirror for me to look in, is my own children. You know? It's hard.
Yeah, absolutely. So. What would they say about you? How would your children describe you?
I don't even want to know. Depends on the day, right? I think they would say that I'm around, I'm present. I certainly have, my weaknesses, and that there's been times when those weaknesses have been more prominent or on the surface than others. But I think they would also say I've been around, and that I've been there, and I think that says a lot, and I think I'll count that as a win.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about your vision and passion for 'Cause I Love You, and what are you hoping to really do in this city?
So going back to that passage in Jeremiah 29:7 says, "Seek the peace and the prosperity of the city, for in its peace you will find your own." And different translations translate that word peace differently. The welfare, the good of the city, blah, blah, blah. But it's the word shalom.
Okay.
And that idea of shalom is really, the word, like the best way to describe it is like its wholeness. And what I would love to see is for the local church here in Colorado Springs to be a catalyst for and a willing partner toward the shalom of our city. And that doesn't necessarily mean, although it would be great, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody comes to faith. If the Lord wants to do that, I'm all in.
Okay.
But I haven't seen that happen in any city, in any era ever yet. But at the very least, I think the people of God can be great partners and participants with other efforts in our city towards the flourishing of people. At the very least, you see siloing if you don't see friction.
Right.
So, and in particular, of late, you've seen a lot of friction in between the church community or the faith community and the government. And the reality is, again, the whys are different, but the commissions from both are very much the same, to care for people.
Yeah.
And they're called to care for people in different ways, or perhaps to create different kinds of opportunities. But we want hungry families to be fed. We want kids to be educated. We want them to be safe and not vulnerable. We want families who are struggling to find ways to not struggle, to create economic mobility, upward opportunity, to stop things from flowing down the drain in the bottom of the bathtub, but to also create capacity at the top so that people can experience upward mobility. So the church is not the only partner in that effort. And frankly, it won't ever be the wealthiest. It won't ever be the biggest.
Right.
But it can be the most trusted. And so I think for me, that's part of our vision at 'Cause I Love You, is that the church, the people of God, not just these institutions where people gather on Sundays, but the people of God would be the city's most trusted partner in advancing human flourishing and addressing human suffering. And if that could ever be the case, like I said, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody comes to the same faith.
Right.
But it does mean that we have this aspiration to be trusted partners, that when a crisis happens, the government or the public sector or the marketplace community, the first thought that they have is, we don't know how to get our hands around this, we should call the church. Because they're at least going to be on our side.
And in the community.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
And you said 5 years you've been.
yeah, formally.
Yeah, and
Yep.
you've I've been to a couple events, and you get a lot of people in the room. What are the different conversations that you have with a politician versus a church authority?
Yeah, they're remarkably similar.
Okay.
So that's the both surprising and not surprising things. So if I have a conversation, I mean, we talk a lot about, in this setting, about mental health. Clearly, mental health is at a crisis level nationwide. It's a societal issue that's affecting every level of our socioeconomic levels and kind of geographically everywhere. But it's certainly very true here in Colorado Springs. And so when we talk about, the church may not use the same language they may not use the term mental health, and if they do, it might have a different set of definitions. But when you start unpacking it and you start talking about how it presents itself, how mental illness presents itself, the folks that are in the church world would say they're experiencing and seeing the same symptoms as those folks who are leading out in the community in public health sectors and nonprofit organizations and all these things. And so again, when we find ourselves like actually talking about the same issues, and we find ourselves using the same language, all of a sudden you can start being like, well, if we experience these things and you're in that setting and I'm in this setting, what can we do about it together? The reality is, our faith community has access to resources to benefit a solution, as does the government and the marketplace and the nonprofit sector, but they're different resources. So there's people, there's dollars, there's expertise, there's time, there's contribution, there's skills, but these different organizations have access to different resources to contribute. But if we all just work in isolation, we're never benefiting from the solution. So it's the collective impact model.
Yeah.
So the conversations that I have with a police chief or a fire chief or the mayor or a council person, they end up being remarkably similar to the conversations I have with a pastor of a local church. The pastor, his purview is this big, whereas a council person or the mayor, their purview is much bigger. But when you can create, starting with a conversation, and then that conversation leads to, well, what could we do together? You start hearing dreams pop to the surface. So you've been in rooms where we've had these conversations. We've put something up on kind of, put a ball on the tee and then just said, what would it look like if we all swung together?
Yeah.
And then great things start to happen from there.
And what would be your vision in 5-10 years?
Well, I think a couple of things. What I would love to see is a local church community that stops dividing itself over these kind of secondary and tertiary things that are probably important on a Sunday morning, but don't really matter to a broader community. So I'd love to see us kind of unified around the things that do matter, and then have a more collegial, trusting relationship with kind of the authority figures in our city. So again, your public officials, elected and appointed, people who are leading kind of major nonprofit or public sector organizations, even our marketplace leaders and some of the people who kind of sit at the top of the economic development chain. So when those, a unified church kind of talking with and listening well to a unified city, and what that would create is safe neighborhoods, strong families, economic opportunity and mobility for people who are kind of at the bottom, and generosity in all kinds of ways, not just philanthropic dollars, but generosity in all kinds of ways from people who are at the top. So that there's this sense of, I know what I was just talking yesterday with a colleague about creating a culture of contribution. And what would it look like if, beyond just volunteerism, where I show up once in a while to help somebody, I started, when I heard about a problem, if I had this thought of, I think I could do something about that, or I'd at least like to do something about that. So I think if in 5 years or maybe more, we've got this idea of a culture of contribution brewing, churches feel like they can contribute alongside our government leaders and our public sector leaders, nonprofits and such, then I think we can start to really move the needle on some of these big challenges that are afflicting our city.
Yeah. And anything specific around mental health going on right now?
Well, yes. So, I mean, it's been a fascinating set of conversations to just talk about this mental health issue and to help the church realize that they can be partners in it. So about a little less than a year ago, one of our city council members, alongside our new mayor, decided that just an easy way, or perhaps just a simple way, maybe not easy, but simple way, to start creating connections, because isolation is such a driver of so many of the mental health crises we experience as a community.
We just talked about that with Cass.
So I mean, that we all know that. I mean, it's U.S. Surgeon General, and everybody down to like local experts would say that that's the case. Can we just create some connections? And so this idea of having 1,000 neighborhood gatherings has been an initiative that we've rolled out, and it's been a pleasure for me. I just came from a gathering of about 50 to 60 local pastors where I'm inviting 100 local churches to be a part of hosting 500 of those 1,000 neighborhood gatherings over this coming summer. Because who better than the local church? I mean, if I remember right, I think the idea of loving your neighbor is pretty,
clear,
consistent, in Scripture. And so, what better way to love your neighbor than by just inviting them to the front porch? And just having a gathering, and whether it's beer in the backyard or pancakes on the porch, or just cordoning off the cul-de-sac and just saying, hey, everybody, bring a potluck and we'll have fun. Research would say, and you know this, that if you know the names of at least 6 of your neighbors, your sense of isolation and some of the anxiety and depression that comes along with those starts to decline dramatically. So for the city to name an initiative and the church to be the first ones to raise its hand and say, we're in, that sends a great message to our city that we're your partners, and it gives us a practical, tangible thing to do to say, oh, I've heard this idea of loving your neighbor a lot. I could just host a party and invite my neighbors to come in, and I'll buy the pancakes. That sounds great. So practically speaking, I love the idea of at the end of this summer, the warmer months here in Colorado Springs, if we can stand up, not only if the city can stand up and say we've hosted 1,000 parties and 60,000 neighbors now know the names of their closest 6 neighbors. If the church can also say, and by the way, we took ownership for 500 of those, and it's been a great way for us to engage the people who sit in our congregations every Sunday as a way to just practically and simply love their neighbor. What a great story to tell.
That is.
So
how can I help as Christy, but also as mentally strong, and now that God clearly told me I have to dig my roots in here?
Well, I mean, I think you've done so, like one of the things that I know you've done in so many different venues is to tell your story. And you and I both know that stories unleash all kinds of things. And so your vulnerability to share your story.
Thank you.
And I mean, first of all, I think what you've created with Mentally Strong, both the curriculum as well as the practice, that we're sitting here, is remarkable. I think just what an opportunity that you've created for people to access help is just amazing. And so I want to say,
Thank
keep
you.
that up. But also your willingness to respond to my invitations, our ability to just continue to connect one another to other people in the city who are involved in this conversation.
Right.
Because I think, again, too many times over the last many decades, the church has kind of isolated itself and said, if it doesn't have Bible verses on it or a cross in the logo or something like that, we're going to create our own version.
Is not to proselytize.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think I want to see the people of God flood these spaces, including the mental health space, which at times has been an uncomfortable one for the church. I want to see them flood these spaces with the hope that comes from Christ, so that we no longer have to separate the spiritual health from the mental health conversation, and people just see it in us, and they see it in you.
Yeah.
I know they do.
Well, I've had my spiritual conflicts too, and you'll see in the grief documentary. It's a very vulnerable, very real,
I can
and
imagine.
but I thought it was also important to show my anger at God, because I think a lot of times as a Christian, you're supposed to just trust. You're supposed to just have faith, and losing children feels unbearable. And it wasn't like I wasn't fervently praying for their protection, and so it actually shows a really clear journey. And I don't know if you know anything about Carl Jung, who is like the guru of psychology. And somebody asked him one time, as he was kind of talking about his own spiritual journey, they asked him, "Do you still believe in God?" And he said, "I used to believe in God. Now I know God." And that's really been my journey. And it's, unfortunately, pain either pushes you away or brings you closer. It's very vulnerable. It's not, Christian-y. It doesn't, I didn't rely completely on God. And we were talking about the title of which we're all going to vote on, and we're not doing this title, but this was between me and my family, and one of my family members said, "Well, your life has often been, compared to Job," and I'm like, "Yeah, but I'm actually a little more like Job's wife." If I'm being completely honest and vulnerable, right? But God doesn't let you go, right? You come full circle, and so very vulnerable. But I think it's important for people to not be scared of exploring spiritual conflict or faith or anything. And we live in a culture of kind of this bipolar, politically, spiritually, religiously, all of these things. You're either, you believe this or you believe this, and it's like God is relational.
And he's never been scared of the emotions that he created us with, right?
Right.
Those emotions that want to say, "Curse you, God! I'm mad at you."
Yeah.
I've had those seasons too. Certainly not to the depth that you have, but God's never been scared of that.
Yeah.
And I have the people that I know who have walked through deep, deep pain and have stewarded that story well, have come out on the other side, much like you, that would say, "I now stand on an unshakable ground. Like, you could not convince me otherwise."
Yeah. Right.
And I have so much admiration for the people who have stewarded that pain really well, including yourself.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, that was good. So tell us exactly how my viewers could maybe get involved with 'Cause I Love You. We'll have all of your information down in the description. And, what could a local business do versus just an individual?
Yeah. So first of all, the website is just COS in the words I love you, causeIloveyou.com. We actually do twice a year, kind of our flagship thing that most people know us about is a thing called City Serve Day. So we do that most years the first Saturday in May and the first Saturday in October. So this coming May 3rd and 4th, we will have about 2,200 volunteers from every sector of our community. A lot of churches.
So that's a busy weekend for you if you end up coming.
It's a bit
to
busy. So we will have, those 2,200 volunteers will be spread out across about 120 schools, nonprofits, parks, community centers, any place that can take volunteers. And it's just it's a great way for on a few hours on a Saturday morning or a Friday afternoon for somebody to connect with. If they've ever wanted to know, like, I want to know more about foster care, but I'm not ready to be a foster parent. Can I just show up and serve for a few hours and get connected to this organization? Or there's a school in an under-resourced neighborhood, or maybe my own neighborhood, and I just want to know more about, like, what are their needs and how I can help. So it's just a good way to kind of dip your toe in the water and find out how I can contribute.
Yeah.
So City Serve Day is just a great way to enter in. And frankly, with businesses, we have a lot of businesses, about a dozen this year, that we'll do some sort of like business discount for somebody who's volunteered. So we've got a couple ice cream shops that you can get a free ice cream cone if you wear your little I Serve Today sticker or whatever. But we've also got some other types of businesses who do, other types of discounts. But then they can certainly send their employees to go out and volunteer and be a part of. That's why we actually do some on Friday, because we got a lot of companies who offer service time. So it's a Friday and a Saturday. That happens twice a year. Beyond that, like, the conversation just starts to open up. And so we do a lot to connect, to build teams around under-resourced schools. And there's so many needs, but they're so practical and tangible that, like I said, like, when you start combining the resources of these different organizations, they can work together to meet needs of educators, families, and kids. And so building teams around local schools, there's all kinds of opportunities there. And then they just start to kind of build from there. So I could give the whole menu, but that's a great place to start.
Okay. We will see how we can get involved.
That'd be great.
Now we have two things that we have to do before May 4th, because Cass's suicide prevention gala is that night too, and she wanted her interview out before then, but we'll make it happen.
Well, if we don't, then there's always one coming up on October the 4th.
Okay.
October the 5th, whatever that Saturday is. October 5th this coming year.
And that's also a
It's another City Serve Day. Yeah.
Okay.
And so we'll have the same thing. It will have, probably closer to 2,500 in the fall, and 125 projects, again, all over the city.
Yeah.
So
perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
This was great.
I feel honored to be a part of the conversation.
What a